Is it going to be audio and video?
Yeah.
Oh, Lord. Sorry for that.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Falcon Spotlight. I'm your host, Rob Flores, here at Cerritos College, Norwalk, California. At this time, I'd like my guest to please introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. I am Pamela Sepulveda. I am a licensed clinical social worker and the community outreach director with CASA Youth Shelter.
Excellent. Now, every time I have a different guest, I like them to start off from, like the beginning. Like, what was K-12 like? Or did you have any special interests? Were you involved in, maybe music or a club or something?
Back when I was in college?
Well, starting off first with, K-12.
Oh, K-12, yes. Oh, yeah, I had a lot of interests. I am an alumni of Pacifica High School over in Garden Grove, and I was a proud athlete. I played volleyball and basketball, and I was on the swim team, and I was in ASB, and definitely was in journalism. I was the editorial page editor of the newspaper, and so I was very involved in my high school during those years. And I also helped co-found with a friend the Interact Club at the local high school, which was the high school Rotary Club. So it was a very active time for me at school.
Excellent. And after high school, did you know what was the next step, what college you wanted to go to, what major?
When I was in high school, I had this dream of going off to this four-year university because that's what I thought you needed to do to have a great career. And life got in the way. My parents divorced, and when my parents got divorced, suddenly that pipe dream of going to the four-year university left, and I found myself presented with the best option for me, which was going to the community college. I headed over to Golden West Community College, and I made sure that I worked my tail off to get all the scholarships that I could so that I could have a full ride through community college and then transferring over to Cal State Fullerton for my bachelor's.
Great. And when you were in college, did you participate in clubs and stuff?
I wish I would have been more active in clubs. I was very focused on my academics because I was on scholarship, and I needed to ensure that I remained on scholarship. I was very involved in the classroom settings. In each class, I was a leader in the classroom, and if there was a note taker back in the 90s when we didn't have these things called computers in classes, they would hire students to take notes if there was a different student in the class, possibly with disabilities, and the student with disabilities would have then a note taker in the class. And so I would get very involved in if there was ever a student who needed a note taker to assist in that way, because again, this was before the computers were all in the classrooms.
And what was the influence for your major and degrees you pursued?
When I was in high school, I knew that I wanted to help people because a lot of people had helped me. And so I wasn't quite sure what that looked like. I just knew that I was very fortunate to have, during my difficult times, a lot of caring people who cared a lot about me, who helped me through those situations. And so I knew that I wanted to help. When I went to Golden West in the community college, I went through just a general AA degree. And then I was advised through the counseling center that Cal State Fullerton had a program where you can get your bachelor's in human services. And I thought, I don't even know what that is. What am I going to service humans? What does that degree mean? But I knew that it was a degree that I could help people. It would launch me into helping people in the community. And so I transferred to Cal State Fullerton into the Human Services Department, where a lot of my cohort would then become teachers and social workers and probation officers and therapists and child development specialists. And so But it was through high school when I realized that people had helped me and that that was an actual job, is that you could get paid to help. And so after I had my bachelor's in human services, I went off to USC to get my master's in social work, which was the last degree. I've decided that I am done going to college.
And for before, because I like to also get the story of the journey as well. Tell me about the early jobs leading up to where you are today.
I've had a lot of jobs. And, funny thing is that currently I am with an amazing organization down the street in Los Alamitos. We're a nonprofit shelter, Casa Youth Shelter. And I've been there for 17 years on and off. And the agency I work for, I firmly believe in. And although I've had a very rich career in social work, I've come back home in the most recent years, back to Casa full-time. In college I had many college jobs. I was a server and a manager at Marie Callender's. I worked in a little boutique that sold Christmas stuff all year long. However, in college, for the degree I was receiving at Cal State Fullerton, we had to do internships. We had to do 3 semesters of internships. And, to any student who's out there having to do an internship, the power of an internship is amazing. It's not only a resume builder, but it also introduces you to the professionals in the field so you can network. And my first semester internship 17 years ago was with Casa Youth Shelter as a undergrad field worker, just learning how to take a crisis call and how to do an intake and how to help a young person in crisis. And I maintained that job part-time, full-time, on-call, different levels of commitments throughout my college years, throughout grad school, and then even after I left grad school. So it's interesting. That was my very first job, and it continues to be now my job, while I've had others in between.
And for those that don't know, what a shelter is and stuff like that, can you tell us, to get an idea?
Absolutely. Well, most of us have this vision of a shelter, and it's a big building, and it's cots or maybe mats on the floor, and there's a slop from the cafeteria that's served, and maybe it's impersonal and it's clinical and it might be dirty and it might be scary, and I'm very proud to say that our shelter is nothing like that stereotype that a lot of us have in our minds. Our shelter is a 12-bed home. It has 6 bedrooms, and it's a house in the city of Los Alamitos that if you're driving down the street, unless you saw the sign, you would think is just another house on the street. The history of our shelter is actually amazing. I love to tell that story, and is this a forum in which I can share that information?
Yeah.
Our founder, Mildred Jones, and it was an amazing woman. She was born in 1909, and I joke with people, it's crazy that I knew her, and she was born before the Titanic sank. That either makes her living really long or I'm old myself. And so she was born in 1909, and as a young girl, she had a friend in elementary school who was taken to a home for wayward children. Back in the 19th century, about 100 years ago, there was no safe place for young people to go. Young people in crisis. If their parents couldn't take care of them or wouldn't take care of them, we didn't have a developed foster care system. We actually didn't even have laws to protect children. We had laws to protect animals, not to protect children. So Mildred's friend was taken to this place where children would just kind of go, kind of like an orphanage, if you will. And her mom took her to visit, and it struck Mildred that there were bars on the window, and her young friend hadn't done anything wrong, but it looked like she was in jail. And that planted a seed for Mildred. And so Mildred grew up and became educated and started helping herself, and she was a teacher and a probation officer and helped a lot of young people. And during World War II, when all the military were going off to fight the war, somebody still had to run the military back here at home, and so they opened up a branch of the Navy called the Waves, which was the women officers who were going to help run things down here on stateside. And Mildred in World War II became a lieutenant commander in the military, in the Navy, which is really remarkable for a woman if you think of where women stood within society back in the 1940s. So she continued on, and she did that same job during the Korean War, and then during the Civil Rights Movement became very active in what we call macro-level help, large-scale help that's going to impact hundreds, thousands, possibly millions of people. When Martin Luther King called for the second march in Selma after the first one was so violent, she answered that call and went and marched and came back out here and helped Cesar Chavez put Union labels on the fruit at the markets. She became very involved in in that large scale change, and started looking at why are the young people in the 60s running away not this in higher rates than they did maybe in the 50s, and became very interested and involved in looking at the plight of young people and their rights. She made a name for herself, and in the late 1970s, Ronald Reagan, when he was, in the late 1960s, when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, he charged Mildred with leading the commission on, I'm going to paraphrase this, why are the kids on the streets? And she did a bunch of research, and she came back and she said, Ronnie, the kids are on the streets because they're either running to something or they're running away from something. And most of them have homes to be in, but they're not safe homes and they're scared. And so that really brought a lot of attention to why are the young people on the street. She had gone up to San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury district, and there was a shelter opened up, Huckleberry, that's still there today. First shelter of its kind in the nation for young people. So she came back down home. She was living in her nice little home with her Navy pension, and told her friends that when she passed, she'd like all of her money to go to a shelter like that in Southern California for young people. And her friends, being the awesome, amazing movers and shakers that they are, said, Mildred, why would we wait? Why would we wait until you die to open a shelter like this? And she said, you're right. So when she was at the young age of 69 years old, she sold her cute little house in Rossmore and bought 2 homes next door to each other in Los Alamitos. In one home she lived, and in the second, the home next to it, she opened the doors. And without the internet, without all social media, just with the power of like word on the street, within 4 hours, the first young person came to our shelter in April 1978. And that's 38 years ago. We've had up to 12,000 youth. This year we'll hit about 12,000 youth who have come through to receive services either through the shelter or the counseling program at our shelter. And that's a woman who had a dream at 68 years old, and she followed her passion and followed her dream. And 38 years later, we're still experiencing the benefits of somebody following their passion and following their dream. Now, she's obviously still not alive. She'd be 100 and many now, 105, I think. But she passed the month before her 97th birthday. She still lived in the home right next to the shelter. And when I started the shelter, she was 90 years old. And there's something to be said for knowing a legend like that, knowing somebody who has passion behind what they're doing, knowing somebody who says, you're never too old to start something amazing, start something great. And when you find an agency that has that kind of history and those kind of roots, and they're an amazing agency, you want to be part of it, which is why I've been with it for 17 years.
Oh, that's amazing. We'll be right back after this public service announcement.
Isn't it law you have to, like, every so often? Is it law that, like, every so often you have to have some
15 and 45 he has his...
Oh.
Yeah, it's a pre-recorded one, and then he has his... read one of these scripts. One of them is a promo, and then the 45 one
okay.
is like a... We switch... And sometimes it could be like to promote one of the events or something, depending if like the dean asks us for like to remember to mention something.
That's cool. So where's the time that we've been on? Like where how do you know it's 15?
I just like watch the time or my watch.
Oh, okay.
And I just try to like keep track of time.
Okie dokie. Yeah, I can talk forever, so you'll have to tell me if I need to shut up.
For all its musical contributions, America has made its greatest mark with jazz, the hot jams, and the cool licks. Armstrong, Mingus, Brubeck, and Miles. The whole spectrum presented each week with insight and passion of WPMD's longest-running series, The Jazz Lounge. Join Anthony and Lisa every Thursday night at 7 Pacific for 2 hours of jazz, big band, and lounge music on the best of The Jazz Lounge, only on WPMD on the net, where people make a difference. What was her name again?
Mildred Jones.
Mildred. Okay. And welcome back here on the Falcon Spotlight, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Rob Flores, here at WPMD Studios at Cerritos College, Norwalk, California, and I'm back here with my guest. Now, you mentioned, Mildred, tell me about, the first time you met her and, the bond you got to share.
Mildred was a tiny lady, but she walked in with a big force and personality. She was probably not much more than 5 feet tall. She was a white-haired lady when I met her. Again, she was 90. And when I met her, and anyone met her, you knew that you were in the room with a legend. This is a woman who had made some major changes in the world. She had started also the first hotline of Southern California for young people to call in if they were in crisis. So I was very humbled. I was very intimidated. And I wanted to make sure that if I was going to take space in her life, that it was going to be appropriate and it was going to be meaningful. She would often come over on our shifts at the shelter and have dinner with us and want to hear how we're doing in our professions and wanting to know how the staff are doing in our classes. And more importantly, she would want to sit with the young people who are residents at the shelter and just talk about how they're doing and listen. She was a strong advocate for less talking from adults and more listening. She was one of the co-founders of the Creative Listeners Guild, which is kind of an offshoot of active listening from Carl Rogers. If you know much about therapy, active listening is one of the cornerstones to being in therapy and getting help. And so she believed strongly in creative listening, and so she was a gentle, kind person. But she was definitely a presence, and there's this joke that goes on still at the shelter that nobody ever would say no to Mildred. Mildred asked for something, you said yes. When she was 90 years old and I just started, the shelter had a 2-car garage that was detached in the back, just like a house would, because it was an old house. And that 2-car garage was the counseling center for the shelter. And when Mildred was 90, she looked at the board of directors and said, hey, I think we should professionalize. I think that we could do better. And so they raised the money and they took that 2-car garage and built a 2-story professional counseling center. Again, at 90, she was still having visions of greatness and still making sure that she was impacting the community around her. And so to be in the presence of somebody like that is humbling.
It's amazing. What happened to the house that she stayed in? Did it just become the same as the other house, or?
Our board of directors had a very pointed, focused conversation. A lot of agencies will get themselves in trouble in that they will have an opportunity to, when her house became vacant because she passed, some agencies would want to grow their programming really wide and reach farther. And our board of directors wanted to be really cognizant that we don't want to just grow wide with our programming and farther and reaching. Rather, we wanted to go deeper. So do what we do and do it really, really well. And so there was talk about, should we open this, this house for a bed for more teenagers, for young adults, what should we do with this? And ultimately we said we need to give this property back to the young people who are currently in the shelter. So her home, if you come to the shelter, is now a basketball court. Because young people need vitamin D, they need to get outside and they need to exercise. Nature's remedy for blues and for depression can be exercise and release endorphins. And so our young people can go out and play basketball or play volleyball, and they're often out there. And if you ever come by the shelter, you'll see that basketball court.
Amazing. What was the relationship like? Did the city officials come and visit her and stuff like that?
Oh, Mildred was very involved, and she was very civically engaged. On our board today, we're very proud to have many amazing community leaders on our board of directors. We have one of the current city council members. We have the current police chief and the 2 former police chiefs on our board. The leaders at the hospital, a lot of the prominent businesses in our community, their leaders are on our board. And so we're very fortunate, and that was all because of Mildred. Not a lot of communities want to welcome a homeless shelter into their streets. There's a lot of stigma around what a homeless shelter might bring. And we're very fortunate that not our shelter doesn't have that stigma, because Mildred made sure that she involved the community in the development of the shelter. Not only on our block in Los Alamitos, there's our shelter, and then 2 houses down, there's another shelter, Precious Life, and that's a shelter for pregnant homeless women. And for 2 shelters to be on one city block in a little city is quite remarkable. And a little fun fact is the city of Los Alamitos has the highest number of nonprofits per capita. So it's a small little city with a lot of nonprofits, and that's because it's a city that cares a lot. And I think that's partly because Mildred was one of those pioneers back in, when the city was developing, that said this is a city that's going to care a lot, and it's going to care about its residents, and it's going to care about making sure that all people have whatever help they need to maintain their livelihood.
That's a very inspiring story that she had. And did she have a family or?
Well, she did have family. However, she did not ever marry or have children, and that was one of the reasons why she was looking at her will when she was in her late 60s as to, what am I going to do with this money when I die? Somebody needs to inherit this because I don't have any heirs. And that's why she then opened the shelter. So now we like to think that she has 12,000 grandchildren because she was the grandma to all the teens in the shelter.
Do you recall, like the last time you talked to her?
I don't recall the last time I talked to her. One of my favorite moments of Mildred was she had a lot of pride and a lot of dignity. And as an older woman, she also had a bad back. And the doctor had given her this hard brace that she'd have to wear around her torso to keep her kind of standing upright. And as a proud woman that she was, she didn't want to be seen as weak. And so she had my mom come over and cover the brace with some lace so that it just looked like that she had an extra little lace camisole on underneath her coat or her sweater. And to me that represented Mildred was a proud woman who, although her body was starting to weaken and slow her down, her mind was still wanting to be represented as sharp and engaged, and she did not want to be minimized in her contributions. So although that's not my last memory, that's one of my my fond memories of her and how she kind of led her life.
You often hear, like when people, became successful and stuff, they had mentors and stuff. Tell my audience, here, the importance of having a mentor. Who else, inspired you?
Absolutely. Well, I certainly had mentors, so Mildred was one of them. I had, when I started at the shelter, the executive director, Lucianne Mulhart, to me epitomized the professional woman that I wanted to be, the administrator that I wanted to be, when I grew up, who I wanted to be. And then I also had our clinical director, Gary Zager, and he was a constant patient professional with the youth who were in crisis. And they were kind of my mom and dad, my professional mom and dad. And if I was not full-time at the shelter and I had gone off and done other jobs, which I worked 10 years as a professional social worker also in other jobs, I could still come back to Gary and Lucianne, touch base with them, talk to them about what I was doing professionally. They always cared, and they always asked where my profession was going, how that interacted with my own life and where I was, and that meant a lot. There's a very powerful piece to having a young person or a young professional, and I don't mean age young, I mean in their years of going into a profession, having a mentor and somebody who can model to them and advise them as to what they're doing.
Another thing I have my guests also do is, provide tips to someone that wants to follow your path and be in the same career that you're in.
I'm in an amazing career. So, I've talked a lot about the shelter, and that's my current job. But professionally, I'm a social worker. Again, I went to USC, and I have my master's in social work. And then I worked many, many hours under a great supervisor, Jeff Middleton, and I took some really hard tests, and I passed them to become a licensed clinical social worker, which means that I can work in a private practice as a therapist. And so if somebody's interested in the helping professions, I would definitely say get your bachelor's in something like social work, human services, human development, child development, sociology, psychology, any of those degrees that's really going to push you towards helping. But if you really want to make money, there's not a lot of money to be made in the helping professions, unfortunately, and I often laugh with my coworkers, the pay we get is not necessarily always financial recognition, but we feel great about what we're doing. So, but often in the helping professions, to really become a professional and not just a paraprofessional, you're going to need to get your master's. So you can get your master's in counseling, master's in social work, maybe your PsyD or your PhD in psychology. I went and received my master's in social work from USC. Go Trojans! It's a great school, and then I worked for 5 years in Los Angeles County with the Department of Children and Family Services. I was for most of those years an emergency response social worker, which means I was the unfortunate person who had to knock on doors to investigate allegations of suspected child abuse. That was an amazing job. It was a very fulfilling job, knowing that I was giving back to the community and helping some of the most vulnerable people out there. And then I transferred over to the East Whittier City School District, where I worked as a school-based social worker. That was an amazing job. I would tell kids my job at the elementary schools, K through 5th grade, was to help the children have a great day at school. If there was something bothering them, maybe family issues or sadness or social skills or anger issues, if something was getting in the way of them learning how to do math and reading, then it was my job to help them work through that. That was a much easier way for young people to understand that I was a counselor rather than saying, I'm the school therapist. They didn't really necessarily understand that. So helping them understand that was my job to help them get through some of those tougher social and emotional issues, sometimes behavioral issues. And then the outreach position opened up at the shelter, and I went to the shelter back full-time as the community outreach director. The thing about social work is that, again, it's a career, and it's a profession, and it's not the type that you're going to go into one job. I can't imagine a social worker doing the same thing in the same company for 30, 40 years. I know I've been connected to the shelter for 17, but that's been full-time, part-time, on-call situations. And it's only in the last 5 years that I've been full-time again. And I, as a social worker, can be a therapist, I can be an advocate, I can be a lobbyist, I can be we're really change agents in the community. And I was drawn to the profession because I knew I wanted to make a difference, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to only do therapy. And when I learned that in social work you can not only just do therapy, but you can also be an advocate, and you can also be a community organizer, and you can also be a change agent for one or two or maybe thousands, I was hooked. And I decided that I wanted to be able to give back in the community. Really, as a little girl, probably too young to remember what this was like to see her on TV, but I remember seeing Princess Diana on TV and thinking, gosh, that would be such a cool job. I want to be a princess, and I want to travel around, and I want to give back to the world. And so I did the social work part, giving back to the world, and so now I'm just looking for a prince to make me a princess. And,
you mentioned, how in the media and stuff, sometimes the shelters aren't how, you would think it that way. Like the movie, the inspiring movie with Will Smith, The Pursuit of Happiness,
Mm-hmm.
and like good deeds and stuff like that, to clear like the misconceptions, that people might hear.
Mm-hmm. The misconceptions of the shelter?
Yeah, like shelters in general. Like if you see movies that...
Well, if you walked into my shelter, so if you parked in front of the shelter, you'd see a house. And it'd have a nice lawn, probably like a lot of the lawns. Well, it's not as green as it should be because, the drought. And then you'd walk in, and we have a lobby, which looks like a front room in a house. And we have couches and a desk. And then you walk through a little doorway, and you have our dining room, which has 3 round tables. Our tables for our teens are round because we want them to encourage discussion and family involvement. And our staff eat lunch and dinner and breakfast with all the teens, and mealtime is really important. Just like many houses, the kitchen and dining room is the center of the house. It's the same for us. Next to the dining room is our TV area, which is a little bit smaller because we don't encourage a lot of TV, but there's 2 couches with a TV, and we often have it on during the day just to watch the news, and then in the evenings they can watch movies and on the weekends. And then there's the kitchen, and it's just like your kitchen at home. It has a refrigerator and a stove, and it looks just like a kitchen would in a regular house. It's not a big industrial kitchen or anything like that. And then a hallway with 6 bedrooms that splinter off of the hallway. In our bedrooms, we were very fortunate to have Roth Staffing come in and help remodel our 6 bedrooms, and they're amazing. And we have 3 girls' rooms and 2 boys' rooms, and then we have a gender-neutral bedroom. And the bedrooms have themes like surfing because we're close to the ocean with a surfboard on the wall, and we have a sports room that has a basketball hoop on the wall. And so it's actually one of the, when you were a kid, you wanted that really cool bedroom. We have those really cool bedrooms. And one of the bedrooms has kind of this peace, hippie, earthy vibe to it with dream catchers, and it's a sanctuary for young people who otherwise might be sleeping on somebody's couch and not sure where they're going to get their next meal.
Also, you had the opportunity to do quite a bit of informative workshops and stuff. Tell me about your how your relationship with the college started, and where else you've done workshops before, because there's a lot of good stuff that you've talked about.
Well, thanks. I am very fortunate to be connected with Shannon Estrada. Shannon is a great resource for your college, and Shannon welcomes me twice a semester to provide a workshop. And there's a variety of different topics that we cover. But I was fortunate to inherit the relationship from Shannon. When I started at the full-time outreach directorship at the shelter, Shannon contacted me and said, "Wait a minute. So you're not the other lady who used to come?" I said, "Oh, I'm not, and I hope that's going to be okay. That we're still going to be having that relationship where we can come provide workshops, and I'm just hopeful that I can be as good as maybe the person before me." And so she said, "Oh, okay." So she brought me over, and after our first workshop, she said, "Oh my gosh, we absolutely want to keep you here twice a semester." So typically I come in March, February, once in February, once in March, and then typically once in September, once in October. And my workshops are on issues like I might talk about communication skills or feelings and coping skills. I might talk about anger management. I've talked about issues of abuse, learning styles. These are topics that we actually pull from. Most of these topics we pull from our parenting program at the shelter. And it allows me to share some of our parenting program with students at the college, educate them about the shelter, give them some great information. Also tell them about, hey, if you end up going to a university in your bachelor's